David Wilson stepped through the boarding gate at Denver International Airport, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings, conferences, and late-night phone calls that stretched across multiple time zones. All he wanted now was to get home to Chicago, sink into his favorite chair, and forget about business for at least one evening. He glanced down at his boarding pass one more time. Seat 2A, first class. After the kind of month he'd had, he felt he deserved the extra legroom and quiet atmosphere that came with the premium cabin. David had always been practical about money, but success in business had taught him that sometimes comfort was worth the investment. The airplane was a standard Boeing 737, nothing fancy but clean and well-maintained. David made his way down the narrow aisle, nodding politely to other passengers as they settled in for the 2-hour flight. His casual outfit of dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and worn leather jacket felt comfortable after days of wearing suits and ties in stuffy boardrooms. As he approached row 2, David noticed a woman in a crisp airline uniform arranging magazines in the seat pockets. Her name tag read, Flight Attendant, Lisa Chen. She looked up as he approached, and something shifted in her expression when she saw him heading toward the first-class section. "Excuse me, sir," Lisa said, stepping into the aisle to block his path. "Can I see your boarding pass?" David paused, slightly surprised by the request. He'd already shown his boarding pass to the gate agent and again when boarding the plane. But he pulled it out of his jacket pocket anyway, assuming she was just being thorough. "Here you go," he said with a tired smile, holding out the boarding pass. Lisa took the paper and studied it for what felt like an unusually long time. She frowned, looked at David, then back at the boarding pass, then at David again. "I think there might be some confusion here," she said, her voice taking on a tone that David couldn't quite place. "This shows seat 2A, but I believe you're probably looking for the main cabin. Sometimes the computer system makes mistakes with upgrades." David felt a flicker of confusion. "No, there's no mistake. I purchased this seat when I booked the flight 3 weeks ago." Lisa shook her head as if David simply didn't understand how these things worked. "Sir, I've been doing this job for 8 years. Trust me when I say these mix-ups happen all the time. Let me help you find your correct seat in the back." The way she emphasized correct seat made David's stomach tighten. He'd experienced this kind of thing before, though never quite so directly. There was something in Lisa's tone and body language that suggested she'd already made up her mind about where he belonged, regardless of what his boarding pass said. "I appreciate your concern," David said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "But there's really no mistake. This is my seat." Other passengers were starting to notice the conversation. An elderly couple in row 1 turned around to watch, and David could feel eyes on him from throughout the cabin. The situation was becoming exactly the kind of public spectacle he'd hoped to avoid. Lisa's expression hardened. "Sir, I need you to understand that I'm trying to help you here. These first-class seats are very expensive, and I'm sure you don't want to be charged for something you didn't actually purchase." The implication in her words was clear, and David felt his patience beginning to wear thin. He'd built a successful business from nothing, owned 3 homes, and could probably buy this entire airplane if he wanted to. But none of that seemed to matter to the woman standing in front of him. "I did purchase this seat," David repeated, pulling out his phone. "Would you like to see my confirmation email? Or perhaps we could call the airline's customer service line together?" Lisa glanced around the cabin, seeming to realize that their conversation was attracting attention. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "Look, I don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be," she said, lowering her voice but maintaining her firm stance. "But I have a responsibility to all the passengers on this flight. If someone is in the wrong seat, it affects everyone's travel experience." David looked around the first-class cabin. There were only 12 seats total, and at least half of them were empty. Even if there had been some kind of mix-up, which there clearly wasn't, there was plenty of room for everyone. "Lisa," David said, reading her name tag again, "I understand you're trying to do your job, but I'm in the right seat. I have the proper boarding pass, and I'd really like to just sit down and relax for this flight." A man in row 3, wearing an expensive suit and gold watch, leaned forward. "Is there a problem here? Some of us have connecting flights to catch." Lisa turned to address the businessman. "I'm so sorry for the delay, sir. Just a small seating issue that will have resolved in just a moment." She turned back to David with a look that suggested her patience was running out. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to please move to your assigned seat in the main cabin. If you continue to refuse, I'll have no choice but to call for assistance." David felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on him. Conversations had stopped, and even passengers still boarding the plane were slowing down to see what was happening. His phone buzzed with a text message, probably from his assistant confirming his ground transportation in Chicago, but he ignored it. "I'm not refusing anything," David said quietly. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for, with the boarding pass that proves it. If you'd like to call someone to verify that, I'm happy to wait." But Lisa had already turned away and was reaching for the phone mounted near the galley. David watched as she picked up the handset and spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end. He caught fragments of her conversation, passenger refusing to cooperate and causing a disturbance. The businessman in row 3 was now visibly annoyed. "How long is this going to take? We were supposed to push back from the gate 5 minutes ago." Other passengers were beginning to murmur among themselves. David heard someone behind him say, "What's the big deal? Let the man sit down so we can get going." But he also heard other voices, less supportive. "There must be some reason she's asking him to move," someone whispered. David remained standing in the aisle, his carry-on bag still in his hand, feeling like he was trapped in some kind of surreal nightmare. All he'd wanted was to get home after a long business trip. Instead, he found himself at the center of a confrontation that seemed to be escalating by the minute, all because a flight attendant had decided he didn't belong in first class. The irony wasn't lost on him. If only she knew the truth about who he really was and why he'd been traveling so much lately. But that revelation would have to wait. For now, all David could do was stand his ground and hope that common sense would eventually prevail. Lisa hung up the phone and turned back to David with a look of grim satisfaction. "Security is on their way," she announced, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "They'll help sort this out." David felt his heart sink. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now spiraling into something much more serious. He looked around the cabin and saw a mix of expressions on the other passengers' faces. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared annoyed by the delay, and a few seemed to be enjoying the drama. A young woman in row 4 had pulled out her phone and was holding it up, clearly recording the entire exchange. When she noticed David looking at her, she gave him a small nod of support. "Ma'am, is this really necessary?" David asked Lisa, trying one last time to resolve things peacefully. "I can show you my credit card receipt, my confirmation email, anything you need to verify that I purchased this seat legally." Lisa crossed her arms and shook her head. "Sir, at this point you've been asked multiple times to move to your correct seat, and you've refused to comply with crew instructions. That's a federal offense." The words hung in the air like a threat. David knew she was technically right about passengers needing to follow crew instructions, but her entire premise was wrong. He wasn't in the wrong seat, and he hadn't been disruptive or aggressive in any way. Heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the plane as 2 airport security officers made their way down the aisle. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The second was younger, with sharp eyes that quickly took in the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" the older security officer asked, directing his question to Lisa. "This passenger is refusing to move to his assigned seat," Lisa explained, gesturing toward David. "He's been argumentative and disruptive, and he's holding up our departure." David opened his mouth to defend himself, but the security officer held up a hand. "Sir, let's start with seeing some identification and your boarding pass." David handed over both documents, watching as the officer examined them carefully. The man looked at the boarding pass, then at David's driver's license, then back at the boarding pass. "This shows seat 2A, the officer said, looking confused. "That's right here." He gestured to the seat David had been trying to reach. Lisa stepped forward quickly. "Yes, but there's obviously been some kind of error in the system. Look at him. Does he really look like someone who can afford first class?" The words came out before Lisa could stop them, and the cabin fell completely silent. Even she seemed to realize she'd crossed a line, her face flushing red as she glanced around. At the shocked expressions of the other passengers, the young woman with the phone made sure she was still recording, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma'am," the security officer said slowly. "What exactly are you implying?" Lisa backtracked quickly, but the damage was done. I just meant that these computer errors happen sometimes and we need to make sure everyone is in their proper place. The older businessman in row 3 had heard enough. Officer, I've been watching this whole thing and this gentleman has been nothing but polite. He showed his boarding pass, offered to provide additional proof of purchase, and hasn't raised his voice once. The only person being disruptive here is the flight attendant. Several other passengers murmured their agreement. The elderly couple in row 1 nodded vigorously, and someone from the back of the first-class section called out, "Just let him sit down so we can take off." But Lisa wasn't backing down. She turned to the captain's door and knocked firmly. After a moment, a man in a pilot's uniform emerged, looking irritated at being disturbed during his pre-flight preparations. "What's going on out here?" Captain Rodriguez asked, surveying the crowded aisle. Lisa immediately launched into her explanation, painting David as an uncooperative passenger who was refusing to follow instructions and causing delays. She conveniently left out the part about her assumption regarding his ability to afford first class. Captain Rodriguez listened with a furrowed brow, then turned to David. "Sir, is there some reason you can't move to economy? We're already running late and I'd like to get everyone to Chicago on time." David felt the frustration building in his chest. "Captain, I'm in my assigned seat. I have the boarding pass, the receipt, and I've offered multiple times to provide additional proof. I'm not causing any disturbance. I just want to sit down in the seat I paid for." The captain looked at the boarding pass again, then at Lisa. "Is there something wrong with seat 2A? Mechanical issue? Maintenance problem?" Lisa hesitated. "No, sir, but I believe there's been a booking error." "Based on what evidence?" the captain asked. Lisa had no answer for that. She looked around desperately as if hoping someone would come to her aid, but even her fellow crew members were watching the scene with obvious discomfort. The younger security officer stepped forward. "Captain, I've verified this gentleman's identification and boarding pass. Everything appears to be in order. Unless there's a specific safety concern or maintenance issue with that seat, I don't see any reason why he can't occupy it." Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Lisa, step aside and let the passenger take his seat. We need to get this aircraft moving." But Lisa wasn't finished. "Captain, I really think we should double-check with the gate agent. Something about this doesn't feel right to me." David watched in amazement as she continued to dig in her heels despite the mounting evidence that she was wrong. The other passengers were becoming increasingly vocal in their support of him, and even the crew members were starting to look embarrassed by their colleagues' behavior. The captain's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Lisa, I'm giving you a direct order. Let this passenger take his seat so we can depart, sir." "I'm concerned about the safety and security of this flight," Lisa replied, invoking the magic words that every airline employee knew could justify almost any action. The captain paused. In the post-9/11 world, any mention of safety and security had to be taken seriously, even when it seemed obvious that the concern was unfounded. "What specific safety issue are you concerned about?" Captain Rodriguez asked. Lisa fumbled for an answer. "He's been aggressive and non-compliant with crew instructions." The businessman in row 3 had finally had enough. "That's completely false," he said loudly. "I've been watching this entire incident, and this man has been a model of patience and politeness. The only aggressive behavior I've seen has come from your flight attendant." The woman recording with her phone spoke up for the first time. "I've got the whole thing on video. This gentleman never raised his voice, never made any threatening gestures, and repeatedly offered to provide proof that he belongs in this seat." Captain Rodriguez looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of his other first-class passengers. Their expressions told him everything he needed to know about who was really causing the problem. But before he could make a decision, Lisa played her final card. "Captain, if you're not going to support your crew, then I don't feel comfortable working this flight. This passenger has created a hostile work environment." David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He'd been in business long enough to recognize a no-win situation when he saw one, even though he was completely in the right, even though multiple witnesses could attest to his reasonable behavior, and even though his documentation was perfectly in order. Lisa had maneuvered things to a point where any decision would be controversial. The captain looked genuinely torn. David could see the man weighing his options: support his crew member and remove a passenger who appeared to have done nothing wrong, or override his flight attendant and risk a crew revolt. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez said finally, addressing David with obvious reluctance, In the interest of getting this flight off the ground and ensuring crew harmony, I'm going to have to ask you to take a seat in economy. The airline will refund the difference in fare." David felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Around him, several passengers began voicing their objections, but he held up a hand to quiet them. "I understand, Captain," David said quietly. "You're in an impossible position." As he gathered his carry-on bag and prepared to move to the back of the plane, David made a mental note of everything that had happened. Every word, every action, every witness. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment David's feet touched the ground at Chicago O'Hare, his phone started buzzing like an angry wasp. Text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications flooded his screen in an endless stream. He hadn't even made it to baggage claim before his assistant Jennifer was calling him for the third time. "David, where have you been?" Jennifer's voice was tight with stress. "I've been trying to reach you for the past hour. Something's happened." "I know exactly what happened," David replied, making his way through the crowded terminal. "I was on the flight where it happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Wait, what? You were on the flight? The viral video flight?" David stopped walking. "What viral video?" Jennifer's voice became even more urgent. "David, you need to get somewhere private right now and call me back. This is bigger than you think." David found a quiet corner near a coffee shop and called Jennifer back. She answered on the first ring. "Okay, I'm sending you a link," she said. "The video already has 2 million views and it's been up for less than 3 hours." David's phone chimed with a text message containing a YouTube link. He clicked on it and watched in amazement as the confrontation on the airplane played out on his screen. The video was crystal clear, shot from the perfect angle to capture both his calm demeanor and Lisa's increasingly unreasonable behavior. The young woman who had recorded it had posted it with the title, "Flight Attendant Refuses to Let Black Passenger Sit in First Class Despite Valid Ticket." The comments section was exploding with outrage, support, and demands for accountability. "Jennifer," David said slowly, "this is going to complicate things." "Complicate what things?" "David, people are calling for boycotts of the airline. Their stock price has already dropped 12% since the market opened this morning. The CEO is probably having a panic attack right about now." David almost smiled at that. If only she knew who the CEO really was. Or rather, who he was about to become. Over the next few hours, David watched from his downtown Chicago penthouse as the story exploded across social media. The hashtag #NarFlightWhileBlack was trending nationwide, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of discrimination while traveling. News outlets picked up the story, and by evening, it was the lead segment on 3 different cable news programs. His phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews, civil rights organizations wanted to offer legal support, and celebrities were reaching out to express their solidarity. David politely declined all interview requests and asked Jennifer to handle the media inquiries with a simple statement. "Mr. Wilson appreciates the support, but prefers to handle this matter privately." What the public didn't know was that David was handling it privately, but not in the way anyone expected. The next morning, David sat in his lawyer's office watching as footage from the airplane played on the conference room's large-screen TV. Thomas Chen, his attorney for the past 15 years, shook his head in disgust. "I've seen a lot of discrimination cases, but this one is particularly egregious," Thomas said. "The flight attendant's comment about whether you look like someone who can afford first class is going to be legally devastating for the airline. I'm not interested in suing them." Thomas looked up in surprise. "David, this is a slam-dunk case. Discrimination, emotional distress, civil rights violation. We could probably get a settlement in the millions." David leaned back in his chair. "I have something else in mind." Meanwhile, at Skyways Airlines headquarters in Atlanta, CEO Richard Barnes was indeed having something very close to a panic attack. The airline stock had continued its downward slide, major corporate cue. Stomers were threatening to cancel their contracts and the board of directors was demanding answers. Barnes called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Around the polished conference table sat the heads of operations, human resources, legal, and public relations, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Where do we stand with the passenger?" Barnes asked his legal counsel. "We've reached out through multiple channels offering compensation, but his representatives keep declining to negotiate." They just keep saying he'll handle it privately. The head of public relations, Angela Torres, looked up from her tablet. Sir, the video now has over 10 million views. We're getting destroyed on social media. Celebrities are posting about it. Politicians are weighing in, and our customer service lines are jammed with people calling to complain. What about the flight attendant? What's her status? The HR director shifted uncomfortably. We placed Lisa Chen on administrative leave pending our investigation. But sir, the video evidence is pretty damning. Our preliminary investigation shows she acted completely inappropriately. Barnes rubbed his temples. How did our crew training miss this? How did we hire someone who would behave this way? Actually, sir, the HR director continued, this isn't her first incident. We have 3 other complaints on file from passengers who felt they were treated unfairly by Chen. All were quietly resolved, but the pattern is concerning. Why wasn't I told about this before? They were handled at the regional level. No one thought to escalate them. Barnes stood up and walked to the window overlooking the Atlanta skyline. What's our next move? Angela Torres spoke first. From a PR standpoint, we need to get ahead of this. Full apology, immediate termination of the flight attendant, comprehensive diversity training for all staff, and a generous settlement offer. The legal department agrees, added the counsel. Cut our losses, minimize exposure, and hope this blows over quickly. But as they were discussing damage control, none of them knew that their biggest problem wasn't the lawsuit they feared or the PR nightmare they were managing. Their biggest problem was something else entirely, something that would make the viral video look like the least of their concerns. Back in Chicago, David was having lunch with his business partner and oldest friend, Robert Kim. They'd built their first company together 20 years ago, selling it for enough money to set them up for life. Since then, they'd been serial entrepreneurs, buying struggling companies and turning them around. So when do you tell them? Robert asked, cutting into his steak. Tomorrow morning, David replied. The acquisition paperwork was finalized yesterday while I was dealing with this mess. Ironically, the viral video might actually help us understand what we're dealing with. Robert shook his head. I still can't believe the timing. You spend 3 weeks flying back and forth negotiating to buy this airline, and then on your final flight home this happens. It's almost poetic justice, David said. For 3 weeks I've been in boardrooms with their executives, listening to them talk about customer service and corporate values. Now I know what their customer service really looks like. What are you going to do about the flight attendant? David considered the question. What would you do if an employee of your company treated a customer the way she treated me? Fire her immediately. And what if that same employee had a history of similar behavior that management had been ignoring? Fire her and investigate why no one was paying attention to the pattern. David nodded. That's exactly what I'm going to do. But first I want to see how they handle this crisis. It'll tell me a lot about the company culture I'm inheriting. That evening, David watched the news coverage from his living room. The story had grown beyond just the incident on the airplane. Reporters were now digging into Skyways Airlines' history with diversity issues, their hiring practices, and their customer service record. Other passengers were coming forward with their own stories of discrimination and poor treatment. The airline's stock price had fallen another 8% during after-hours trading. Financial analysts were predicting a long-term impact on the company's reputation and bottom line. David's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Skyways just announced they're implementing immediate policy changes and diversity training. CEO is doing a press conference tomorrow morning. David smiled. Tomorrow morning was going to be very interesting indeed. Richard Barnes had no idea that the man he'd been unconsciously discriminating against was about to become his new boss, or rather, his replacement. As David prepared for bed, he thought about the events of the past 24 hours. A simple business trip had turned into a viral sensation, a national conversation about discrimination, and the perfect setup for what would happen next. The irony wasn't lost on him. Lisa Chen had assumed he didn't belong in first class because of how he looked. Tomorrow she would learn that he didn't just belong in first class, he owned the entire airline. Richard Barnes stood at the podium in Skyways Airlines' main conference room, facing a sea of television cameras and reporters. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his usually confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious nervousness. Thank you all for coming, Barnes began, his voice slightly shaky, I want to address the incident that occurred on Flight 447 2 days ago and outline the steps Skyways Airlines is taking to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." In the back of the room, David Wilson watched quietly, having slipped in through a side entrance just as the press conference began. He wore a simple black suit and had positioned himself where the cameras couldn't catch him, curious to see how Barnes would handle the crisis. "First and foremost," Barnes continued, "I want to offer our sincere apologies to the passenger who was wrongfully treated on our aircraft. The behavior displayed by our employee was completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values of Skyways Airlines." A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Barnes, this video has been viewed over 20 million times. What specific actions are you taking beyond just apologizing?" Barnes cleared his throat. "We are implementing immediate company-wide diversity and sensitivity training for all employees. We're also reviewing our customer service protocols and hiring practices to ensure this type of incident never occurs again." "What about the flight attendant involved?" another reporter called out. "The employee in question has been terminated effective immediately," Barnes announced. "We've also discovered that there were previous complaints about this individual that weren't properly escalated. We're conducting a full review of our complaint handling procedures." David almost smiled. Barnes was saying all the right things, but David knew it was too little, too late. The company's culture problems ran much deeper than one problematic employee. "Have you been in contact with the passenger who was discriminated against?" asked a reporter from the front row. Barnes hesitated. "We have reached out through various channels, but the gentleman has chosen to handle this matter privately. We respect his decision and remain open to dialogue. Sources tell us the passenger was offered a substantial settlement. Can you confirm the amount?" "I can't comment on the specifics of any settlement discussions," Barnes replied, loosening his tie slightly. What Barnes didn't mention was that they'd offered David increasingly large sums over the past 48 hours, starting at $50,000 and working their way up to $2 million. Each offer had been politely declined by David's representatives, leaving the airline's legal team baffled and increasingly nervous. After the press conference ended, Barnes retreated to his office where his senior staff was waiting for him. The mood in the room was grim. "How do you think that went?" Barnes asked, slumping into his chair. Angela Torres, the head of public relations, shook her head. "The stock market will tell us everything we need to know. But honestly, Richard, I think the damage is done. This story has taken on a life of its own." "What's our exposure looking like?" Barnes asked his legal counsel. "Without knowing what this passenger wants, it's hard to say. The fact that he's not engaging with our settlement offers is concerning. He could be planning something bigger." Barnes laughed bitterly. What could be bigger than a multi-million-dollar lawsuit? Before anyone could answer, Barnes's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Barnes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. He says it's about the Flight 447 incident." Barnes and his team exchanged glances. "Did he give a name?" "David Wilson." The room fell completely silent. Barnes felt his stomach drop into his shoes. After 2 days of trying to reach this man, he was suddenly standing in their lobby. "Send him up immediately," Barnes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, should we get our legal team involved?" his counsel asked. "No," Barnes replied. "Let's see what he has to say first." 5 minutes later, David Wilson walked into the conference room and Barnes was struck by how different he looked from the tired traveler in the viral video. David was immaculately dressed, moved with quiet confidence, and had an air of authority that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Wilson," Barnes said, standing to shake hands, "thank you for coming. I want to personally apologize for what happened to you on our aircraft." David accepted the handshake with a neutral expression. "I appreciate that, Mr. Barnes. I'm here because I think it's time we had a conversation about the future of this airline." Barnes gestured to a chair. "Of course, please sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." David sat down and looked around the room at the assembled executives. "I assume these are your senior staff members?" "Yes, this is Angela Torres, our head of public relations, James Mitchell from legal, and Susan Crawford from human resources." David nodded to each of them in turn. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I'm here instead of filing a lawsuit or accepting one of your settlement offers." "The thought had crossed our minds," Barnes admitted. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "The reason I'm here is because I have something that might interest you." He slid the folder across the table to Barnes, who opened it with curious hands. As Barnes read the first page, his face went pale. "I don't understand," Barnes said slowly. "What is this?" "Those are the finalization documents for my acquisition of Skyways Airlines," David explained calmly. "The purchase was completed yesterday morning, about 18 hours after your flight attendant decided I didn't belong in first class." The silence in the room was deafening. Angela Torres looked like she'd seen a ghost, and James Mitchell was frantically flipping through the legal documents, trying to understand what he was reading. You bought the airline?" Susan Crawford managed to ask. 51% controlling interest," David confirmed. "I've been working on this acquisition for the past 6 months. The 3 weeks of travel that led up to the incident on Flight 447 were spent in final negotiations with your board of directors and major shareholders." Barnes was still staring at the documents in disbelief. But how? I mean, who are you?" David smiled for the first time since entering the room. "My name is David Wilson. I'm the founder and CEO of Wilson Equity Partners. We specialize in acquiring underperforming companies and turning them around. Over the past 15 years, we've successfully restructured 12 different businesses across various industries." "You're that David Wilson?" Angela Torres whispered. "The one who turned around Pacific Manufacturing and Global Logistics?" "Among others, yes." Barnes was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "So when Lisa Chen was treating you like you didn't belong in first class?" "I was actually flying home from signing the papers that made me the majority owner of this airline," David finished. "The irony wasn't lost on me, I assure you." James Mitchell leaned forward. "Mr. Wilson, if you own the company now, what does this mean for the lawsuit? For the public relations crisis?" David considered the question. "That depends on what I find when I start looking into how this company really operates. The incident on Flight 447 wasn't just about one problematic employee. It revealed something much deeper about your corporate culture." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the airplane hangars in the distance. "I've been reviewing Lisa Chen's employment file. 3 previous complaints about discriminatory behavior, all quietly swept under the rug. No additional training. No disciplinary action, no intervention of any kind." Susan Crawford shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Those incidents were handled according to company policy at the time." "Your company policy was to ignore patterns of discrimination?" David asked, turning back to face the room. We resolved each complaint individually," Susan stammered. "You paid people to keep quiet," David corrected. "There's a difference." Barnes was beginning to understand that this meeting wasn't going the way he'd hoped. "Mr. Wilson, what are your intentions regarding the company's current management structure?" David returned to his seat and fixed Barnes with a steady gaze. "That's an excellent question, Richard. What would you do if you discovered that a company you'd just purchased had been systematically mishandling discrimination complaints for years?" "I suppose I'd want to investigate the scope of the problem and implement corrective measures." "And what would you do with managers who had been overseeing these failures?" Barnes realized he was being asked to essentially fire himself. I suppose that would depend on the extent of their involvement and their willingness to change." David nodded. "Those are reasonable answers. Unfortunately, they're about 3 years too late." He gathered his papers and stood up. "Effective immediately. I'm assuming operational control of Skyways Airlines. Richard, I'll need your resignation letter on my desk by 5 o'clock today. Susan, your last day will be Friday. We'll need time to transition your responsibilities. Angela and James, your positions are under review pending a full audit of your departments." The room erupted in shocked voices, but David held up a hand for silence. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's business. The viral video from Flight 447 has given me a perfect case study of how this company operates when it thinks no one important is watching. What I saw was completely unacceptable." As David walked toward the door, Barnes found his voice. "Mr. Wilson, what about the public relations crisis? How are you going to handle the fallout from all this?" David paused at the door and smiled. "Richard, by the end of the week, the story won't be about an airline that discriminated against a passenger. It'll be about a passenger who bought the airline and fired everyone responsible." With that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of people whose world had just been completely turned upside down. 3 months after the incident on Flight 447, David Wilson stood in the same conference room where he'd revealed his ownership of Skyways Airlines. But everything else had changed. The walls that once displayed corporate platitudes about customer service now featured real testimonials from passengers and employees. The atmosphere was different too, energized, hopeful, and genuine. Around the table sat his new leadership team. Jennifer Martinez, formerly an operations manager who had been overlooked for promotion for years despite her excellent track record, was now vice president of operations. Kevin Zhang, a customer service representative who had consistently received outstanding reviews from passengers, had been promoted to head the newly created Department of Passenger Experience. Dr. Amara Okafor, a diversity and inclusion expert David had recruited from outside the company, served as chief culture officer. "Let's start with the numbers," David said, opening the quarterly review meeting. "Jennifer, how are we looking operationally?" Jennifer pulled up a presentation on the large screen. "On-time performance is up 18% from last quarter. Customer complaints are down 32%. And employee satisfaction scores have improved dramatically across all departments." "What's driving the improvement in employee satisfaction?" David asked. "The new promotion and evaluation system is a big factor," Jennifer replied. "When people see that advancement is based on merit rather than politics, it changes everything. We've promoted 23 employees in the past 3 months, and 17 of them were previously passed over despite strong performance." Kevin Zhang raised his hand. "From the passenger experience side, the feedback has been incredible. The new training program is working. Our flight attendants and gate agents actually understand what customer service means now." David nodded. The comprehensive retraining program had been one of his first initiatives. Instead of generic sensitivity training, they'd implemented a system based on real scenarios and practical application. Every employee had gone through it, from baggage handlers to pilots. "Dr. Okafor, what's your assessment of our cultural transformation?" Amara smiled. "It's remarkable, honestly. I've worked with dozens of companies trying to change their culture, and I've never seen results this dramatic. I think the catalyst was your decision to be completely transparent about why changes were happening." David had indeed been transparent. Rather than quietly restructuring the company, he'd told the entire organization the story of Flight 447 from his perspective. He'd explained that he wasn't just the victim of discrimination, he was now their owner, and he was committed to building an airline that would never allow such incidents to occur again. The key was showing rather than just telling. Amara continued. "When employees saw that Lisa Chen was fired not just for the viral incident, but because management had ignored a pattern of discrimination complaints, it sent a clear message about accountability." "Speaking of Lisa," David said, "have we heard anything about her legal action?" James Mitchell, who had managed to keep his job by demonstrating genuine commitment to reform, shook his head. "Her wrongful termination lawsuit was dismissed last month. The judge ruled that her termination was justified based on documented discriminatory behavior and violation of company policies." "What about the other employees we let go during the restructuring?" "Most have moved on," James replied. "A few have found new positions where they're reportedly doing well. Sometimes people just need a fresh start in a different environment." David was pleased but not surprised. He'd never believed in destroying people's careers unnecessarily. Even Richard Barnes, the former CEO, had been given a generous severance package and strong references for his operational experience. Despite his failures in corporate culture, "Let's talk about the financial impact," David said, turning to his new CFO, Patricia W. Illiams, whom he'd recruited from a competitor. Patricia pulled up another set of charts. The first month after the ownership change was rough, as expected. "We saw a significant drop in bookings due to the negative publicity. But starting in month 2, things began to turn around. Customer loyalty is now higher than it's been in 5 years. What's driving that turnaround? Word of mouth primarily. When passengers see the difference in how they're treated, they tell their friends and colleagues. We're also seeing strong corporate account growth as businesses appreciate our new commitment to diversity and inclusion." David smiled. The business case for doing the right thing had proven itself once again. "We've also launched the Skyways Foundation," Patricia continued. "The scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation has generated tremendous positive publicity." The foundation had been David's idea, funded with a portion of the money that would have otherwise gone to settling discrimination lawsuits. Instead of paying victims to stay quiet, they were investing in creating a more diverse next generation of aviation professionals. Kevin Zhang spoke up again. Can I share something from the passenger feedback surveys? Of course. Kevin pulled up his tablet. This is from a business traveler who flies with us twice a week. I've been flying for 20 years and I've never experienced customer service like this. It feels like the airline actually cares about passengers as human beings, not just revenue sources. He scrolled to another comment. And this one from a family who was traveling with young children. When our flight was delayed due to weather, the crew went above and beyond to keep the kids entertained and make sure we had everything we needed. Other airlines would have just left us sitting there. Those are the kinds of comments that drive repeat business, David said. What about our employee retention rates? Jennifer checked her notes. Turnover is down 45% company-wide. In customer-facing positions, it's down even more. When people feel valued and properly trained, they tend to stick around. Dr. Okafor added, we're also seeing more internal applications for promotions. People used to assume advancement was impossible unless you had connections. Now they see a clear path forward based on performance. David looked around the room at his team. 6 months ago, most of these people had been working under a system that undervalued their contributions and ignored their potential. Now they were leading the transformation of an entire company. I want to share something with all of you, David said. Last week I flew on one of our flights, not as the owner doing an inspection, but as a regular passenger. I bought a coach ticket under a different name and went through the normal boarding process. The room was silent, everyone curious about what he'd experienced. The difference was night and day. The gate agent was friendly and professional. The flight attendant greeted every passenger with genuine warmth. When a family with a crying baby was struggling, other passengers and crew members offered help instead of complaints. It felt like flying on a completely different airline. That's because it is a different airline, Jennifer said. Same planes, same routes, but completely different values. David nodded. Which brings me to an announcement. Based on our performance over the past quarter, the board has approved my recommendation to expand our route network. We're adding 15 new destinations over the next 18 months. The room erupted in excited conversations. Expansion meant growth opportunities for everyone. But more importantly, David continued, we're going to serve as a model for how airlines can operate when they truly prioritize both passengers and employees. I've been invited to speak at the International Aviation Conference next month about our transformation. As the meeting wrapped up, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had started as the worst flight of his life had become the catalyst for creating the kind of company he'd always wanted to work for. The viral video that had initially seemed like a nightmare had ultimately served a purpose. Millions of people had witnessed the old Skyways Airlines at its worst, and now they were seeing the new Skyways Airlines at its best. The contrast was powerful and undeniable. Later that evening, David sat in his office reviewing passenger feedback surveys. One comment in particular caught his attention. From a passenger who had flown the same route as Flight 447, I heard about the incident that happened on this route a few months ago and was nervous about flying with this airline. But my experience was absolutely wonderful. The crew was professional and welcoming to everyone. Whatever changes were made after that viral video, they're working. David smiled and closed his laptop. Tomorrow he would board another Skyways flight, this time openly as the owner. He would sit in first class if he wanted to, or coach if he preferred, and he would be welcomed either way. Not because of who he was, but because that's how every passenger deserved to be treated. The transformation of Skyways Airlines was complete. But David knew that maintaining this culture would require constant vigilance and commitment. The real test wouldn't be how they handled the spotlight of change, but how they operated when no one was watching. Fortunately, he'd built a team that understood this responsibility. They weren't just running an airline. They were proving that businesses could be both profitable and principled, that success didn't require compromising values, and that treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. As David turned off the lights in his office, he thought about Lisa Chen, the flight attendant whose discriminatory behavior had started this entire chain of events. He wondered if she understood the irony of what had happened, that her attempt to humiliate a passenger had ultimately led to the creation of a better, more inclusive workplace for thousands of employees. Sometimes, David reflected, the universe has a sense of justice that transcends individual actions. The story that had begun with discrimination and prejudice had ended with opportunity and transformation. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, the possibility for positive change always exists, sometimes in ways no one could have imagined.